So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that this project was researched and written and delivered today on the ancient, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolo nations. You may be more familiar with it as Vancouver, British Columbia. Just want to welcome everyone, and then I'll turn it over to Tomie and Louis. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we've already done the land acknowledgement section. This was the agenda for today. We've done intros, and so we'll be setting some ground rules, which I think everyone is already familiar with. And then we'll be talking a little bit about the history of feminism, and then feminism in the margins, and what that means. I already introduced myself as well. Maybe some additional information is that I'm currently in my 5th year at UBC, where I study post-colonial critical race theory and counter-narratives. Okay, so these are the ground rules slides. So some values are respect, listening to understand, engagement, openness to understand different ideas and lived experiences, willingness to engage in challenging conversations, waiting for your turn, using I instead of we statements, being conscious of how much or how little space you're taking up. Ask yourself who should be the center of the conversation, who should be centered, whose voice should be centered, challenging ideas, not people, understanding the difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling safe, and then self-reflecting. So I thought that I would keep the brainstorming section the same as it's been run before, which is to help us ask questions like what it is that we hope to achieve, what do we hope to take away, and then maybe write them down and compare them later on. So I came up with this list for the goals for my specific presentation, which is to leave with a better understanding of feminism, of where and how it started, better understanding how feminism upheld white supremacy, and how it still can in many ways, and still does in many ways. Being able to identify things like racism, transphobia, ableism, and classism in feminist media, in feminist theory, and then developing a more mindful practice of feminism, and understanding that it's different for every person. And then understanding the baseline for intersectionality. Is there anything that you feel is missing from this list, or that you personally would like to focus on? Or maybe we can answer some other questions like, what is feminism to you? Where did you first learn about feminism? And do you consider yourself a feminist? Sometimes when we think about words like feminism, they're usually positive for most people. They bring up positive images, but when you accompany them with things like white supremacy, it changes our perspective and the histories behind words like feminism. Does anyone want to talk about whether or not they consider themselves a feminist and why or why not?
Yeah, sure. I'll go if nobody else wants to. When people ask me, are you a feminist? I usually say, well, yes, of course I'm a feminist. But I'm just careful to adhere to certain types of feminism. And I try to make it clear that when I'm having conversations about feminism that are more in depth, that it's not usually what people think of when they first hear the word feminism, or what they would assume when they first hear the word feminism. But generally, when people ask me face to face, do you identify as a feminist? I'm going to say yes, because I would rather adhere to that than saying, no, I'm not. But it is a personal thing for me. And when given the chance, I'd rather go in depth about what I actually believe instead of just covering it with the label feminism.
Yeah, great point. I think my own perspective on it will, I think we'll see my own perspective on that as we proceed. So I will move on. Okay, so we often hear about feminism as categorized by waves, which are movements that are divided by periods of time. and all have their distinct priorities. So what we now call first wave feminism spanned from 1848 to 1920 and was comprised of middle to upper class white women. Their main goal was to have the right to vote. And history usually tells us that in Canada, women, and I say women very cautiously because this didn't include Black women or Indigenous women, women of color, but women in Canada were given the right to vote in 1918. So this was white women were given the right to vote in 1918. And then begrudgingly, Black women were granted the right to vote in 1922 by the Canadian government. And then Indigenous women were denied that right for many more decades to come. So the next wave, second wave feminism, is often considered the most racially prejudiced or racist wave of feminism. Nevertheless, it spanned from 1960 to 1980 with, of course, white women at the center again. And I wanted to emphasize here that the racism was very deliberate. It wasn't something that just happened to take place or just happened to exclude women of color. It was very intentional. And there were a couple of reasons why it was so adamantly white. And the first was that at the time, many white feminists aligned themselves with conservative ideology because they felt that that kind of political alignment would further their agenda, which was essentially the desire to work or to be equal to white men. And the second, maybe lesser known fact is that Black men were granted the right to vote roughly around this time. So as we know, Black men have endured a long history of racial stereotypes that are very much still prevalent today that pose them as a threat against white women. So their racism was largely due to these two things. And it's important when we're talking about feminism to be aware of this history. So in response to white feminists basically asserting their own autonomy by jettisoning women of color into the margins, third wave feminism, which began in the 90s, saw a rise in Black voices. So this was when Black voices and other women of color. This was when Kimberly Crenshaw began her work on intersectionality, which is still the foundation for feminism today. A lot of the time, these biases and these historical things don't just end when you see a date on a piece of paper. The effects tend to extend and then linger on into the present, and in many cases into the future as well. So the last bit of context is what some folks call fourth wave feminism. So that would be roughly from 2010 to the present. So right now, there's a very big focus on interrogating gender essentialism. So binaries that have traditionally excluded trans people, non-binary people, and then how those biases impact trans women, specifically trans women of color, non-binary people of color. So we're beginning to see a shift from focus given to people at the center, so to cis white women, and now to people at the margins of feminism, who up until this point have largely been voiceless. Okay, so are there any questions or observations or any things that people want to add or say for that whole section?
Where does radical feminism fit in all of this?
Radical feminism began during second wave. So it has its roots in second wave feminism, but radical feminism is actually, I feel, gaining more popularity even in the present. Does anybody else want to speak on that?
Yeah, sure. I will. Radical feminism definitely has seen it has become more popular in about the past 5 years. We saw it really spike when Donald Trump was up for election in the United States of America. and during his presidency, because once again, because radical feminism kind of was birthed during the second wave, a lot of white feminists today, you'll find a lot of conservative and self-identified Republican women do still identify as feminists, but their feminism only adheres to what benefits them. And so we saw radical feminism and radical feminist topics kind of come back into the mainstream. And there has been a little bit of a debate and conversation around what if radical feminism could be more inclusive? What if we could change radical feminism to include more people? And so there has become a lot of arguments and a lot of fear from trans people in the uprising of radical feminist theory and thought as well, because it's almost seen as reactionary due to a lot of laws being passed to include trans people more and to, talk about gender essentialism more and how that harms folks. We also see the rise in radical feminist thought and thinking coming with it. So that's kind of where we're at today. Obviously, places in the downtown east side, organizations in the downtown east side, most of them are trans inclusive. I say most of them because especially folks that work in the downtown east side know that there are some that are not trans inclusive. I won't name names obviously for this, but there are shelters and spaces that do not allow trans women still to this day, and are very adamantly against trans women and are very pro radical feminism. So even when you are working in the downtown east side or working in the social services, you have to be very weary of the organizations that you work for and the politics that they adhere to.
Actually, Rian, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what is radical feminism, and then how is it different from trans exclusionary radical feminism?
Like radical feminism in itself gave birth to a lot of things that we know today that created what we use the terminology safe spaces for women as. So radical feminism is why we have things like shelters for women, why we have things like women-owned things or women-centered spaces or things made and designed for women. A lot of that has its basis in radical feminism. However, when you start to understand that, you can also recognize that all of these things, all of these spaces, places, things like women's shelters, women-owned things, women-owned whatever, a lot of them were incredibly exclusive to only white women, middle-class women, usually able-bodied women as well. However, we can still recognize that a lot of places like the Women's Health Collective, as well as a lot of the other organizations in the downtown east side, were created by radical feminists because they do believe, and they did believe, that women need their own, they need to separate themselves from the patriarchy, is a huge belief of radical feminists. Now, trans exclusionary radical feminists are people that adhere to the same sort of idea. So they adhere to the separation of men and women, but they are very bioessentialist, so more essentialist than your normal radical feminist would be. So they believe on the separation of the biological male and the biological female, which therefore begins to actively subjugate and marginalize any person who does not identify with their gender assigned at birth. So trans people, non-binary people, they also are not, they don't believe in or support intersex people. So the the real question here, though, is how much of their politics can we really separate from each other? We have to understand that a lot of radical feminists and TERFs share the same political beliefs to an extent. It's just that TERFs will take it 1 or 2 or 3 steps farther than your normal radical feminist would. But there is right now a lot of radical feminists who are trying very hard to separate themselves from TERFs. But it's really up to the individual, especially trans people and women of color, to decide for themselves whether or not they feel safe around folks that adhere to this ideology, and whether or not they want to participate in these spaces and political ideologies, whether they want to agree or believe this when people say that they're not the same or different. So yeah, that was a lot. And there's a lot more, but they are different to an extent, but really it's up to trans people and people of color to decide whether or not that's safe for them.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to, I didn't see whoever brought that up in the first place. I also could add that when you're reading about feminism from a lot of famous feminist scholars that were published a while ago, a lot of them, including Black women, so including Bell Hooks, who I'll be mentioning later on, at the time identified as radical feminists, because these notions that radical feminism must exclude trans people or anybody who doesn't fit within their strict criteria is something that's evolving over time. And I think getting more and more violent as time moves on, but those attitudes weren't necessarily in place when a lot of these theorists were writing their work. So that's just a little thing I wanted to add in case you come across writing by scholars from the past who use that terminology. Moving on to what is feminism and can it trouble us? By trouble, I mean that a lot of people, I think, feel afraid to pinpoint faults in feminism because it might be considered taboo in certain cases. But nevertheless, I think it's very important to do so because of the history that we've talked about just now. So in 2000, Bell Hooks, who is a very acclaimed Black feminist scholar and race activist, who actually just passed away recently, she published a book titled Feminism is for Everybody, A Passionate Politics. So in it, she puts pressure on this phrase that feminism is inherently for everybody, because as we've seen, that hasn't historically been the case. But she opens with this definition of feminism. Feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. So yeah, again, these words often have very positive connotations for most people, though the origins of feminism deserves interrogation and deserves reflection as well. And I wanted to take this moment to ask this question, to hear your answers. What do you think it means to interrogate the trouble with feminism? What does that mean for you personally? So I wrote here to understand or to be unafraid to acknowledge the racism, the different problems at the beginning of the movement that still remain in many cases at the very center of the word for many people. And then to activate that knowledge in the present. That's what it means for me. Okay. So obviously this is an issue that's very close to my heart. The racism within feminism that's still, to me, very present today. So whiteness is a privileged category regardless of gender. And I think that's something that people often forget when talking about feminism. So the feminism that emerged following the civil rights movement, so this would be second wave feminism, hinged upon the notion that white women were superior to Black women and to all women of color. It hinged upon this. And as Bell Hooks notes, these people who called themselves feminists were united under the rubric of white supremacy. And women of color remained on the margins of feminism. And much feminist theory emerged and still emerges from privileged women who live at the center. And at best, this form of feminism, it lacks wholeness, and at worst, it cannot or it should not be called feminism at all in current times. And because of this, many women of color have rejected feminism's proposal for this kind of unified global sisterhood, or have separated themselves from the movement entirely. So I'm thinking of people like Patricia Hill Collins' Mother work, and then Sandy Grandi's Indigena. So yes, mainly women of color who do not feel that they have been included in feminism and have felt the need to create their own terminology. So to me, feminism must do these things. So it must be anti-racist and anti-colonial, decolonial. It must be aware of privilege and acknowledge that oppressions between women are not equal. And it must prioritize those at the margins. And it also must be a continuous effort, not just some sort of given that happens because of gender or how you were born. What do you guys think of these points? Do you disagree, agree, or is there anything to add? Any observations?
I will also add on that with anti-colonial or decolonial, we can also talk about being anti-imperialism and understanding imperialism and its longing effects on colonialism as well. Also understanding that the way that feminism is practiced in the West, so in North America, is very different from the way that feminism is practiced in the rest of the world, and always understanding those differences. I think that's important because when we talk about prioritizing those at the margins, we also need to talk about women that do not live inside of North America or westernized countries today, so like Europe as well. That's why I think that number 3 is probably my favorite point, I guess, because we also have to constantly be asking us what those margins are, and what marginalized means, and what they look like, because as we start talking more about intersectionality, understanding intersectionality, a lot of amazing activists and scholars and theorists and people that have done amazing work even struggle to get outside of the westernized understanding of feminism, and the westernized understanding of all of these things. And I think that that also lines up with it being a continuous effort, though, and understanding really what we mean when we say that it's a continuous effort. It means that you decide to do this every day, and that you decide to put this into practice every day, and that you decide to put this into, you decide to live your life with these values and with the people that you surround yourself with. And it's a lot, and people have to understand that when they start getting into the work or when they start studying it from the very beginning.
And also that this continuous effort thing doesn't necessarily mean that you're continuously trying at the same things, right? I think more what I was going for was that like Rian said, like the margins are always changing. And then so our definitions of what is good feminism must also always change. And then in that sense, it becomes a continuous work in progress. Okay, so this is my little portion on essentialism. So what is essentialism? So essentialism is the belief that things have set characteristics that make them what they are. So in that sense, gender or bioessentialism is the notion that men and women are fundamentally different due to their biology. So it gives rise to harmful stereotypes that marginalize those that cannot conform. So non-binary people, trans people, etc. And what quickly starts to become apparent is another point of contention within discourse on feminism. What does the word seek to include, and what does it exclude? And then what does feminism, or sorry, who does feminism work for? And who does feminism work against? I thought I would include this little section on self and other. This is a little bit of theoretical language, but when we're having conversations about essentialism and about inclusion and exclusion, I think it's a conversation that's important to have. So the self, from a theoretical perspective, refers to an individual, a subject with selfhood, so a person. And then the conditions and quality of otherness, so to be the other, is a state of being that's different or is alien from the social identity of people that are the self. Does that make sense? So you can think of it like this. There is the one, and then there is the other. Conversations about otherness are very important to have when speaking about topics like this. So to digress back to essentialism, feminism has a very long history of excluding the other. So whatever society at the time deemed as other, so this included women of color and people affected by trans misogyny. So trans women, intersex people, gender nonconforming people, trans feminine people, anyone who experienced the intersection of transphobia and misogyny. Feminism that conforms to an essentialist framework is always othering. I think that our feminism, when we're talking about who it is that's marginalized or prioritizing people who are marginalized, it really is to say that we are considering their state of otherness and how we can tailor our beliefs to accommodate people who have been othered. That really is it. That's really all I have to say about the matter. Basically, it's that feminism should remain open to interrogation, as we've talked about, meaning that it's a constant work in progress. And work in progress meaning that it has to always actively be decolonizing and always actively be prioritizing the other, the people that are in the margins. It also must take into account the intersections of race and gender and prioritize those that are the most affected. That's what we mean when we say intersectionality. And again, it's to prioritize the people that are not at the center. People that experience the most violence from the patriarchy. Our feminism should strive to work hard on their behalf. Okay, so these were kind of the points that we discussed earlier. I thought that I would bring them back up and see if we have any new thoughts or any new takes now that we've talked a little bit about it.
I'm really curious. Someone asked you if you were a feminist. What's your perspective on that?
There was a quote that I attached in the presentation that was about how what a white person might call patriarchy is something else to me, right? So I feel that myself included and a lot of other people of color, they might have different priorities that aren't specifically about feminism. They're worried about other things that end up encompassing issues that feminism brings up. But the reason why I focus this presentation so much on race is because sometimes for people of color, the race element outweighs any kind of theory or conversation you can have about gender. That's my perspective on it. So it's very fraught. I don't think I could give a solid yes or no answer.
I would like to add to that a little too, because I feel like really similarly, second wave feminism in Canada was precipitated on the exploitation of Filipino women's labor. Because the second wave of feminism in Canada, which allowed like more white women to join the, the white collar workforce. They needed they needed women from like this global south, which is like mostly Filipino women, to take care of to take care of the household and like their children. And so like this what they called feminism actually was at the detriment of other women specifically, like and like this is still happening. Yeah, it is really fraught for me specifically, because like I feel like, but I also feel like I don't get asked if I'm a feminist, because I had this thought for a while that like me being brown kind of takes over that, not just for me, but for people who perceive me. It's like it's not like a thought that comes into their head, like is like this person is a feminist, because it's like my brownness overrides like my femininity, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on it recently. So if anyone else has
Yeah, I've never been asked that question ever. Yeah, and I think it's what Louis said. It's because for white people, usually my race takes priority, and then for other people of color, they would never think to ask me that, because I think inherently there's a lot of shared perspectives amongst people of color about that. But yeah, along with what Louis was saying, I think it's important to also remember that freedom usually always comes at the cost of unfreedom to somebody else. So like Louis' example of, when white women were fighting to have the right to work, that freedom came at the cost of labor by Filipino women, Filipino people at the home, right? So that's why when talking about feminism, it can be very fraught for a lot of people. I want to add that these topics are allowed to make you upset. They're allowed to, to provoke emotions in you. They don't have to just be sort of neutral observations of the facts. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share these things with you. Yeah, again, it's something that is close to my heart, something that I study. So yeah, thank you.